Good evening. I'm going to be reading from my memoir, A Quarter Inch from My Heart. Kind of strange to be revisiting it after all these years. I'll be reading from chapter 3, which basically sets up the main narrative in the story. In late September, there were still lingering news stories about Hurricane Katrina's aftermath and plenty of blame to go around for everyone in government on the local, state, and federal level. The after effects had produced the largest migration of people since the Dust Bowl, with as many as 500,000 people displaced. The population of metropolitan New Orleans had been cut in half, some reports said. Most ended up in nearby Baton Rouge or Houston or Atlanta, but without a doubt, folks from the Big Easy were popping up all over the country, including in the Big Apple. School was going well. I seemed to be a natural at teaching, and the young college students liked me, despite my initial fear of walking into the classroom. I was fully engaged in writing workshops and graduate literature classes. I had saved some money from my previous job, but my income was significantly less than what it once was, so I had to be careful with my spending. One evening in early October, the phone rang. I was watching Jeopardy, but I have always had a habit of picking up the phone and then frittering away lots of time talking to friends instead of studying or preparing for the next day's work. "Hello, Kevin? It's Maurice," he began, and then added after my shocked pause, "From New Orleans." "Maurice, yes, of course, I remember." I was overly enthusiastic. "How are you? I've been wondering how things have been going for you in New Orleans." "Well, not so good. I lost everything in the hurricane," he answered. "But I'm up in New York now," he continued, sounding as chipper as I had remembered. "You're kidding. Where?" I felt a New Yorker's sense of unease. What does he want from me? "This place in the East Village, just temporarily. How are you doing?" My life seemed rather mundane compared to what he had probably been through, but I summarized the recent details. At one point, the operator interrupted. Maurice needed to deposit more coins. "Sorry, I'm using a payphone," he said. Not wanting to waste more time and his limited resources using the phone, we made hasty arrangements to meet the following night at the Riviera, a restaurant in the West Village. 24 hours later, we were eating our burgers at the Riviera, and he had finished giving me the summary of his journey from New Orleans, which involved him and a neighbor pushing his elderly Aunt Josephine through the floodwaters in an old washtub, a quick stop at the ineffectual Superdome, a long walk and eventual bus ride to Atlanta to deposit Aunt Josephine with one of her relatives, and his further trek to New York, ending up in the Bowery shelter. Maurice told all of this without self-pity, and by all accounts, he had hit the ground running in New York. He had signed up with job partners and was studying to take a test for a job that would involve teaching seniors about new medical insurance options, and he was working part-time at Magnolia Bakery, made famous by the television show Sex and the City. Maurice told me his parents had died in a car accident when he was about 12 years old. He had been raised upstate in New York, somewhere near Syracuse. He had been taken in by a foster family. He mentioned a sister named Tracy. Nothing more was said about family. Maurice was dressed in black Dickies-type slacks, a Batman t-shirt, and gray hooded sweatshirt. He wore sneakers that seemed to still have that wet, soggy smell, and he carried a backpack with all his belongings. "I'm not leaving anything at the shelter," he said. "Why don't you stay at my place until you get back on your feet?" I said. I hadn't even paused. It was like I couldn't control the insanity that was spilling out of my mouth. The truth is, I had heard an unmistakable voice, kind of like Darth Vader, in my head, which said, "Take him in." I'm a pragmatic guy and cannot claim to have ever heard voices before. But I could not deny that that's what I heard. I believe it was the voice of God. Even so, within a moment of my offer, I thought, Kevin, you're nuts. You don't even know this guy. From a practical standpoint, I had little to give. I lived in a walk-up studio in Midtown, the large one-room bisected by floor-to-ceiling bookcases. On one side was my bed, a television, desk, and a drawer. On the other, a small table and a fold-up, single-sized futon bed. There was something about his energy and optimism, that childlike quality, along with my desire to do something, as perhaps many Americans were longing to do, that firmed up my resolve. Really? His eyes grew wide with disbelief. He hadn't yet seen my small place, but evidently anything was better than the shelter, where there had recently been a shooting. It would be so helpful to me while I'm studying for this exam. Not a problem, I said magnanimously. In fact, I'm going away next week, and you could feed and keep my cat company, so that would be a help to me. It was like I had no filter, and my brain was not sending stop signals to my mouth. On the one hand, my mind kept trying to short-circuit my behavior, and yet my heart was fearlessly calm. Maurice asked me if I was absolutely sure, explaining that if he left the shelter, there would be a lot of bureaucratic red tape involved to get him back into the system again. We agreed that he would finish out that week, which would prolong some sort of benefit such as food stamps, and then move in with me over the weekend. It looked as if Maurice was on a fast track to finding his way, working one job and studying for a new career, and with a can-do attitude that was very seductive for someone who wanted to help. I expected him to remain with me for about 2 weeks. When Maurice climbed the 4 flights to my apartment, he seemed neither surprised nor disappointed by the size and rather gritty appearance of the building. It was like many older buildings in New York that landlords are slow to fix, hoping tenants will move out. I also warned him about the cockroaches that were rather plentiful due to the slovenly man that lived across the hall with his dog, birds, and piles of stuff that come with living alone in a rent-controlled apartment for 30 years. I gave him the 5-second tour and started asking more questions about his ordeal. Sensing my uneasiness, perhaps, he pulled out some identification, a birth certificate and a Virginia license, which he hadn't bothered to renew since having a car when he lived in Richmond a few years before. He was eager to prove his worth to stay in my place, which I considered a dump. After a time, I ordered Chinese food and we watched Family Guy, his choice. I had never seen that irreverent cartoon, but I quickly rediscovered that wicked sense of humor I remembered from our encounter in New Orleans. While I was up in Massachusetts with my family and trying to enjoy a week of October foliage, there was a convergence of Jewish holidays and Columbus Day that gave me a week off from school. I was growing increasingly wary about the near stranger who was staying in my apartment. What if he was cleaning me out, stealing my identity? Why wasn't he answering the phone when I was calling at 11 at night? What had possessed me to do such a thing? Maybe I was crazy and hadn't really heard a directive from above. Was I trying to make a boyfriend out of this unlikely prospect? While there was some attraction to him on my part, that had not been addressed nor pursued by either of us, and I was, finally, old enough to know better than to complicate such a situation at that stage of my life. It was pretty clear to me early on that that kind of relationship was not how this would and should play out. Maurice never called himself gay, but like the city of New Orleans itself, was open to anything. In fact, he talked more of girlfriends and female crushes than male ones. His shame about his homosexual yearnings was years deep. What was in this for me? Was I really so selfless, or did I have some need to do the ultimate good, to prove to myself, my family, or the world at large that I was a worthy person? Furthermore, would I have offered my home to a stranger if he had been white? Did I have white guilt, as James Baldwin had written about, that made me go a little further to help a black man? Did I still need to prove to someone that I was not racist? And why let him in if I couldn't trust him? I was mentally trying to poke holes in the story of his journey. Why hadn't I asked more questions? How did he leave the Superdome with an elderly woman? Details of his life in New Orleans now seemed too sketchy, and with each day of my vacation, I became more convinced that I'd been had. If the truth was different from what he was telling me, maybe I didn't want to know it, because clearly, whatever his true circumstance, Maurice was a man in trouble with few resources. Small comfort to me, but nevertheless, I tried to justify my actions. The voice of God no longer seemed like enough.